So it all started with a 2007 KLR 650. I've owned motorcycles before this, but this was the gateway into the dual sport world for me. It changed how I viewed motorcycles in the sense that they could become a tool for exploration. I loved the KLR 650 for what it was, a cheap 50/50 machine that is bomb-proof, but at this point, I was more in love with the idea of dual sporting than the bike itself. Towards the end of my time with this bike, which was about a year and a half or 2 years of ownership, I was riding it almost exclusively on trails and gravel roads, so I figured I'd try and get myself on something lighter and sold it. After that, I very briefly owned a 1995 KLX 650C. I didn't own it for long, had some issues with it, parts were impossible to find, and there wasn't really a big enough difference between it and the KLR to justify keeping it, so I sold that. That's when I got my 2002 DRZ 400S. This is the bike that really sold me on dual sports. I liked the bike when I first got it, but after doing the 3x3 exhaust and jet kit, I loved this bike. With roughly the same power as the KLR while being 100 pounds lighter, you could really hoon around on this bike. I had this bike for about 2 years and never once regretted purchasing it. I had no trouble tackling tougher trails, doing fourth gear wheelies, shredding back roads, and really having a fun time on this bike. But then I started to ride in colder weather and realized that carbs sucked for that. I would literally have to warm this thing up for 5 to 10 minutes before I even thought about touching the throttle on it when temperatures were below freezing or it would die. Not only that, but the bike also left me stranded with a carb issue once.
I just keep my feet on the ground as like training wheels. Oh, this is fun. Oh no, I'm stuck! No, I'm legit sunk in.
In addition to the DRZ, I got a 2017 Africa Twin. I figured this would scratch the itch for the EFI bike I want while also giving me something more road-oriented to cruise with. The AT was awesome. Weight-wise, it felt smaller than my KLR when riding, but with 3 times the amount of power. It was actually amazing off-road for its size, too. It was a blast to ride. The main thing I remember about this bike is how smooth it was and how it sounded. It just had a raw bark to it that was just so distinctive. My main issue at this time, though, was storage, though. I lived in an apartment complex, and my landlord wouldn't allow 2 bikes at our complex. So due to space constraints, I decided to sell both and get 1 bike to just do everything.
Jesus, type Wyatt. I said Jesus, type Wyatt. Yes, Dad.
So this is when we get to the GOAT, my trusty 2008 WR250R, the bike that basically started this channel. This machine solved my space constraint and EFI issue. Not only that, while it's advertised at 20 to 30 pounds lighter than the DRZ, it feels more like 50 pounds. This is the bike that really elevated my riding abilities and got me into more of the harder riding. I always wished it had more power, but I didn't want to sacrifice the super high maintenance intervals yet. Especially since at this time I didn't know much about how to work on bikes in general, let alone I couldn't afford a performance dual sport bike at this time. This is probably the bike I'll forever remember as my favorite, and I have so much sentimental value in it that it's just such a great machine to and through. I owned this bike for probably 4 to 5 years and I never had an issue with it, but I took this thing everywhere, single track, interstate, cities, you name it, I rode it. I basically used this bike as a dirt bike though, and the more I used it, the more I started to hate road riding. So I guess you could say this is the bike that fully converted me into the dirt bike scene. I want to be transparent now though. I don't own this bike anymore, and it's mainly because my wife and I moved to a city, but I'll get into more detail on that in the next bike, as it ties into the reason why I bought my next bike.
Ow. Oops.
In between these next 2 bikes, I did own a couple dirt bikes as well. I had a 2008 YZ250F that I tried to convert into a woods bike, but realized that MX bikes just aren't made for woods. And I also had a 2017 KTM 250 SXF that I got for super cheap just to flip. The KTM was honestly terrifying for a 250, super fast and super light. Another bike that I almost forgot about is my old DR650. It was a 2012 model. I bought this bike while I had my old WR250R and mainly got it just to try it out. People rave about this bike online and I honestly thought it was a little overhyped. Don't get me wrong, it's a much better bike than the KLR 650, but it also had a lot of the shortcomings that the KLR suffers from as well, such as a dated design, terrible suspension, a carburetor. And the main thing that killed it for me is the fact that the bike is physically tiny for a 650. At my size, that alone kills it. I can see why people like it though. Smooth motor, great low end power, oil cooled, less weight than the 650, than the KLR, and a fairly planted feel when riding rougher stuff. It's overall a good bike, a great 50-50 bike at that, and they can also be had for very cheap. Next up is my Tenere 700. I bought this bike because I now live in a city and figure I'd just commute to the local trails that are all now at least an hour away. It was a great bike that reminded me of a much lighter, much improved version of the Africa Twin in a lot of ways, but I still find myself never riding on the streets and just trailering the bike to the trails, at which point it had me thinking, why didn't I just buy a dirt bike? The T7 was great and fit me the best out of all the bikes I owned in terms of ergonomics, but I didn't love it. Just like the Africa Twin, there was too much to break and too much weight to break you in the gnarly off-road stuff, and it kind of always discouraged me from going out there and riding the harder trails that I enjoyed. It was honestly kind of an impulse purchase, seeing that I walked into my local dealer and they had one with no markups or dealer fees, so it was just MSRP and taxes out the door. Regardless, I actually ended up trading it for a 2022 CRF 450RL plus a good sum of cash.
I got a bunch of burrs on me. Yeah, this is rough. Oh God, it's so muddy. Jesus. Right into a really...
So that just leaves me with my new CRF 450RL. What do I think of it? Well, I haven't had it for long, so all I have is first impressions, but it's a very raw experience. Stock, I hated it, but after adding the exhaust and ECU, it's a beast now. Road riding is a blast, but I find the power to be actually a bit overwhelming in the dirt. It has so much power it's not even funny. Plus it's super light and nimble. I haven't really owned it long enough to form an opinion about it yet, but if I sell this bike, it's just going to be for a straight dirt bike, and I don't really want to lose the plate yet, as I really want to do the full TWAT, Trans-Wisconsin Adventure Trail, and the Northern Wisconsin Adventure Trail with all the off-road portions.
Oh, I'm still in second gear. Ah, it's okay. We'll burn that clutch out.
This was all in the span of about 8 to 9 years, and you may be thinking to yourself, wow, that's a lot of bikes in that time. And I'd just say, yeah, it is. I'm 6'7" and I have a really hard time finding bikes that fit me well, so I've tried a bunch of different machines to find out what works best for me. If I had to go back in time and pick out the bikes that I regret selling, it'd probably be my DRZ 400 and the KTM 250 SXF. I know that I said I'd probably get a straight dirt bike if I sold the 450 RL, but if I come across a really cheap DRZ, I'm gonna snag it. And I know I said that the WR250R was my favorite, but having owned one for as long as I did, I kinda got wanting one out of my system. But I'd want the KTM back because now I know that a different ECU makes a hell of a difference in terms of how bikes feel with the new 450 RL that I have. That 250 SXF would have made a hell of a woods bike with the right ECU tune. Thanks for watching, everybody. I appreciate y'all, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to comment. See ya!